That night, the rain fell like a wound torn open in the sky. It came without warning, the way the worst things always do. First a distant rumble that sounded like a tired god clearing his throat, then a wall of water that erased the horizon entirely. The town of Hallow Creek sat at the foot of the Ridgeback Mountains in eastern Oregon, population 843, and it had seen storms before. But the people who lived long enough to grow old in that valley all said the same thing afterward. They had never seen a storm like the one that came on the night of October 14th. By 9 o'clock, Ridgeback Road was a river. By 9:30, the eastern slope above the old Callaway mine was groaning with accumulated weight, the soil saturated far past the point of holding. And by 10 minutes past 10, when the mountainside finally let go, the sound it made was not a crash or a roar. It was something lower, something more ancient, a long, wet exhale, as though the earth itself had simply grown tired of pretending everything was fine. The mudslide took the road first. Then it took the fence posts, the old stone wall, the rusted mailbox that had stood at the end of Blackwood Lane for 30 years. And then it took the small figure that had been running along the road's edge, a boy, 10 years old, his yellow rain jacket swallowed instantly by the gray-black surge of churning earth and water. The town sirens began their mechanical wail somewhere in the distance. Flashing lights gathered at the safety line, 100 yards back from the unstable slope. Deputies and rain slickers stood at the edge of the light, looking into the darkness where the road used to be. Nobody moved. The ground was still shifting. The mine's old support structure groaned somewhere beneath the mud. One wrong step and a person could be swallowed just as easily. Nobody moved. Nobody except her. She came from the dark at the edge of the emergency lights, a German shepherd, large and dark-furred and wild-eyed, her chain dragging behind her where she had torn it free from the rescue shelter's side fence. She hit the mud at a full run and didn't slow. She didn't hesitate. She plunged into the roaring brown current like she had somewhere to be and nothing left to lose. Which, as it happened, was exactly the truth. Because in 3 days, Ella was scheduled to be euthanized. And in the enormous, terrible calculation of that fact, the mudslide was the least frightening thing she had run into in months. To understand Ella, you had to start at the beginning, not at the rescue shelter with its smell of disinfectant and quiet despair, and not even at the base in Kandahar, where she had learned to be something extraordinary. You had to start at the moment she first understood what she was for. She was 14 weeks old when Sergeant Daniel Marsh first knelt down in front of her cage at the military working dog training facility in Lackland, Texas. He had large, steady hands, and he smelled like cedar soap and gun oil, and something underneath it all, a particular quality of patience that Ella, even as a puppy, recognized as safe. He offered his knuckles for her to smell. She pressed her nose against them for a long time. This one, he said simply. Their training took 18 months. In that time, Ella learned to locate explosive compounds with an accuracy rate that made her evaluators stop talking and start writing things down. She could detect trace amounts of TATP, RDX, and PTN through layers of clothing, concrete, and packed earth. She could do it at a dead run. She could do it in pitch darkness, in rain, in the choking dust of an Afghan summer. She could do it with Daniel's hand signal or his voice command, or, increasingly, without either, because she came to know what he needed before he knew it himself. They were deployed 4 times. Ella cleared 612 structures. She flagged 41 devices. 31 of those devices, had they not been found, would have killed people. She knew this not in the way a human knows a statistic, but in the language her body spoke, the way tension drained from Daniel's shoulders when she sat down to signal a find, the way his breathing slowed from fast and shallow to something approaching normal. She kept him alive because his aliveness was the organizing fact of her world. The last day, the day everything broke, was a Tuesday in November. The patrol was a standard sweep of a market district in a town whose name she could not have known. She was working ahead of Daniel, as always, nose quartering the ground in a systematic grid when she caught it. A complex scent signature, layered, partially masked with motor oil and dried chili peppers. She sat. She looked back at him. Daniel radioed it in. Yodi was 20 minutes out. They waited. The device went off anyway. Nobody ever fully explained how. The official report used words like command detonated and secondary trigger mechanism. What Ella knew was simpler and more absolute. She had been 15 feet ahead of Daniel when the pressure wave hit. She had been knocked into a drainage ditch. When she clawed her way back out, ears ringing with a sound like the end of the world, the street was full of smoke and screaming. She found Daniel by smell. She always found him by smell. He was alive. His legs were wrong, but he was alive, and she did what she had been trained to do. She bit down on his sleeve, gently, carefully, and she pulled. She pulled him 42 feet to a doorway while the fire burned around them. She pulled him even when he stopped making sounds. She lay across his chest until the other soldiers came. He died in the field hospital 3 days later. Internal injuries, the report said. Complications. The words were clean and clinical and said nothing about the way he had looked at her in those last hours, his hand resting on her head with the same steady weight it always had. After that, Ella was not the same. The evaluators called it operationally induced PTSD with aggressive behavioral indicators. What that meant, in practice, was that she flinched at loud noises, that she had bitten a handler who raised his arm too quickly near her face, that she spent long hours pressed against walls and corners with her eyes fixed on middle distances that contained nothing anyone else could see. She was retired from service at age 5 and entered the adoption program with a behavioral flag on her file that read, "Caution, not suitable for families with children or other animals. Requires experienced handler only." 14 months passed. 3 potential placements fell through. The rescue facility in Hallow Creek took her as a last resort, on the condition that she be re-evaluated within 60 days. The 60 days came and went. The evaluator's report was not encouraging. On the morning of October 11th, the shelter director, a practical woman named Sandra Cole, made the call that nobody wanted to make. Ella would be euthanized on October 14th. It was the humane thing to do, she told herself. It was the only thing left. In her kennel at the end of the row, Ella lay with her nose on her paws and did not eat the food in her bowl and did not look up when the other dogs barked at passing cars. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and she cataloged the world in the only way she knew, by what it smelled like. Concrete, bleach, metal, fear, her own and everyone else's, all tangled together into something she could no longer separate. 3 days. The Callaway mine had been a producing silver mine from 1962 to 2003, when the primary seam ran dry and the operation shut down. The tunnels were supposed to have been sealed. The shafts were supposed to have been reinforced with concrete flood barriers. There were permits and inspections and signed documentation that said, officially, that the Callaway mine was safely decommissioned and posed no risk to the surrounding area. What the documentation did not mention was that in 2019, a private company called Ridgeback Resources LLC had quietly acquired the mineral rights to the adjacent property and had been running exploratory operations through a lateral tunnel that connected to the old Callaway system. Operations that were not permitted, not inspected, and not on any public record. What the documentation did not mention was that Ridgeback Resources had spent 4 years blasting through the old tunnel walls with charges that had compromised the structural integrity of the entire eastern shaft system. What the documentation did not mention was that Sheriff Dale Grant had received, over those 4 years, a total of $214,000 in cash, deposited in increments small enough to avoid bank reporting requirements, into an account registered to his brother-in-law's landscaping company in Medford. Marcus Webb knew about the tunnels. He was 38 years old, and he worked underground because it was what he knew, what his father had known, what paid the bills in a town where the bills were hard to pay. He had worked for Ridgeback for 8 months, and in those 8 months he had grown increasingly uneasy about the state of the support structures in the lateral tunnel, the way certain sections of ceiling had begun to show stress fractures, the way water was seeping through walls it shouldn't have been able to reach, the way the whole eastern section felt, on some mornings, like a held breath. He had filed 2 internal safety complaints. Both had been reviewed and dismissed. He had told his wife, Mary, that he was thinking about quitting. He had not yet quit. On September 3rd, at 2:14 in the afternoon, the eastern shaft collapsed. Marcus Webb died before the rescue crews reached him. He was 47 feet underground, in a section of tunnel that the official investigation would later describe as structurally unsound due to natural settling and inadequate historical reinforcement. The investigation was conducted by the county sheriff's department and concluded within 6 days. Its findings: natural disaster, no negligence, no criminal liability. Sheriff Grant announced the findings at a press conference. He wore his dress uniform. He spoke of the tragedy in a steady, measured voice and accepted the condolences of the assembled townspeople with visible gravity. He was very good at this. He had been very good at this for 23 years. His son was 10 years old. His name was Noah. Noah had been waiting outside the mine that afternoon. He was not supposed to be there. He had ridden his bike the 2 miles from school to surprise his father, who sometimes let him eat his packed lunch at the picnic table near the site entrance on days when the weather was good. He had heard the sound of the collapse from the road. He had dropped his bike and run, because that was what you did when you heard a sound like that. You ran toward the person you loved. He had reached the site in time to see the cloud of dust rising from the collapsed entrance. He had seen the workers emerging, coughing, their faces pale. He had watched them count. He had watched the counting stop. He had not spoken since. The doctors called it selective mutism secondary to acute traumatic stress. His mother, Mary, called it grief that had nowhere to go. His teacher called it a phase, then stopped saying that after the 2nd month. Noah himself, if he could have explained it, might have said something about how the words had been in him before, all the ordinary words, the good morning and can I have, and do you want to hear something cool, and how after the dust cloud rose above the mine entrance, those words had simply ceased to exist, the way his father had ceased to exist, not dramatically or with any particular noise, but absolutely, with a finality that left no gap to push language through. He communicated in drawings. He had always been a good drawer. His father had called him the artist and kept a folder of his work on the kitchen counter. Now he drew constantly, compulsively, in notebooks that he filled and stacked under his bed. He drew the mine. He drew the tunnel system, rendered with a geometric precision that surprised everyone who saw it, based on the fragments his father had described to him at dinner over the years. He drew the support structures. He drew the cracks he imagined were there, in places he had never seen. He was 10 years old, and he could not speak, and he drew underground maps with the focused intensity of someone trying to prove something to a world that wasn't listening. The Hallow Creek Animal Rescue Center smelled, to Ella, like 17 dogs, for cats, 1 rabbit, industrial cleaning products, the particular anxiety sweat of the young woman who had tried twice this week to reevaluate her temperament, and underneath all of it, something harder to name, the smell of time running out. She had learned that smell in Kandahar, where it clung to men in the minutes before certain things happened. It was not quite fear. It was something more resigned than fear. It was the smell of an organism that had done its accounting and found the numbers didn't work. She lay in the corner of her kennel with her back against the wall and her nose pointed at the door. She had not finished her food in 6 days. She did not sleep in long stretches anymore, because the dreams came when she slept, the pressure wave, the smoke, Daniel's sleeve between her teeth, the weight of him. She slept in short intervals and woke with her heart slamming against her ribs, and then she lay still and waited for her heart to slow. Old Tom came in at 8 o'clock every morning. He was 68 years old, tall and thin with a white beard and hands that moved slowly on purpose, the way experienced animal people learn to move. He had volunteered at the rescue center for 11 years. He had outlasted 3 directors and 2 complete staff turnovers. He came in, he cleaned, he filled water bowls, he talked to the animals in a low, unhurried voice that asked nothing from them and offered nothing except the plain fact of his presence. He talked to Ella the way he talked to the others. "Morning, girl," he said, setting her water bowl down outside the kennel door without making eye contact. "Gonna be cold today? Got that autumn smell to it." Ella watched him without moving. "Sandra told me about the 14th, he said, still not looking at her. He sat down on the low bench across from her kennel and propped his elbows on his knees. "I disagree with her assessment, for the record. I want you to know that. I don't think you're broken. I think you're sensible." He was quiet for a while. The morning light came in at a low angle through the high windows. "There's a boy," he said eventually. "I know his mother from the hospital. She's a nurse there. His name is Noah. He went through something terrible a couple months back, and he doesn't talk anymore. His therapist thinks an animal might help. Not a therapy dog. They tried one of those. Trained golden retriever. Lovely animal. Noah wouldn't go near her. Too cheerful, I think. Too fixed. He needs something that's been broken. He paused. I was thinking about you. Ella shifted slightly on her haunches. She looked at him. I know it's a strange idea, Tom said. I know you don't do well with children. I read your file. He clasped his hands together. I also read Daniel Marsh's service record. He wrote a supplementary note on your operational file. Did you know that? Most handlers don't bother. He wrote, Ella is not a working dog. She is a partner. She reads situations with a complexity I cannot fully explain. Whatever she does because she has chosen it. Tom was quiet for a moment. I thought you might want to know that someone said that about you. He stood up slowly, his joints audible in the quiet of the morning. I'm going to ask Sandra to give me 3 days, he said. I'm going to ask her to let me bring Noah here, just once, and see what happens. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. He looked at her directly then, for just a moment, but I think it might work. He picked up his cleaning supplies and moved on to the next kennel. Ella watched him go. Then she lowered her nose to her paws and breathed in the smell of the morning. Cold air, dead leaves, the distant chemical signature of rain still 3 days away, and something else. Something she had not smelled in a long time. Possibility. Small and cautious and not to be trusted yet. But there. Noah came on October 13th, the day before the scheduled euthanasia. Tom brought him at 10 in the morning, the boy walking beside the old man with his hands deep in his jacket pockets and his eyes moving carefully over everything, cataloging. Mary had come too, hovering at the entrance with the careful, hovering quality of a person who has learned to interpret the world through its impact on someone else. The center was loud. 8 dogs responded to the new arrivals with a chorus of barking that ricocheted off the concrete walls. Noah stopped walking. He didn't cover his ears or turn away. He just stopped, and his face went very still in the particular way it had, like a lake going flat before a storm. Tom walked him past the other kennels without stopping, talking quietly the whole time. Not to Noah specifically, just talking, giving the noise somewhere to go. At the end of the row, he stopped in front of the last kennel. This is Ella, he said. All the other dogs were still barking. Ella was not barking. She was sitting in the center of her kennel with her ears up and her amber eyes fixed on the boy with an attention that was different from the way she looked at other people. Other people she watched with wariness, the constant low-level threat assessment of an animal that had learned the world was unpredictable. But she watched Noah with something that did not quite have a name. She smelled him first, of course. She smelled him before he reached the kennel, the specific chemistry of a child who had not been sleeping well, who carried a particular hormonal signature of prolonged grief. She smelled the pencil graphite on his fingers, the faint rubber smell of his sneakers, and underneath all of it, deep in his skin's chemistry, something that her nervous system recognized without her understanding why. He smells like someone who has been underground, she would have said, if she had words. He smells like someone who has sat in the dark and waited to find out if the world was still there. She knew that smell. She had worn it herself. Noah looked at her. She looked at him. The other dogs kept barking. Neither of them moved. Tom stepped back without saying anything. Mary, at the entrance to the row, pressed her hand over her mouth. After a long time, 2 minutes, maybe 3, Noah took one step toward the kennel. Ella's ears moved, tracking him. She did not get up. She did not growl. She sat with her weight evenly distributed and her attention completely, absolutely on his face, and she breathed in what he was. He took another step, then another. He stopped when he was 2 feet from the kennel door, close enough to see the old scar tissue along the left side of her neck, where the shrapnel had torn through. Close enough to see the way her rib cage rose and fell with a steadiness that was clearly hard-won, clearly chosen. He sat down on the floor cross-legged. He put his hands in his lap. Ella looked at him for another long moment. Then she walked slowly to the kennel door and lay down on her side. Her nose 2 inches from the wire, pointed toward him. She exhaled, a long, quiet release of breath, and her eyes, watching him, slowly softened from the razor edge of vigilance to something quieter. Tom, from the far end of the row, felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. He pulled out his phone and, very quietly, began to record. He came back the next afternoon. Sandra Cole had agreed to a 48-hour extension. She would not say it was because of the look on Noah's face when Tom told her about the kennel floor visit, but it was. Noah brought a notebook. He sat down in front of Ella's kennel the same way he had the day before, cross-legged, hands in his lap. He opened the notebook to a blank page and began to draw. He drew slowly, carefully, his pencil moving in small, deliberate strokes. He drew the outline of a dog lying down, the proportions careful and specific. Ella's proportions, Ella's particular way of holding her head slightly tilted, Ella's scar. Ella watched him draw. She was lying down again, nose at the wire, eyes on his hands. After an hour, Tom left them alone. Not gone. He stayed in the corridor outside the main door, where he could hear but not be seen. Mary sat in the small waiting room with a coffee she wasn't drinking, watching the clock. At some point, Tom could not have said exactly when, Noah moved. Not dramatically. He simply shifted forward onto his knees and reached his right hand toward the kennel wire. His hand was small. His fingers were ink-stained at the tips. They extended into the space between the wire links and held very still, palm up, in the universal gesture of offering that transcends species and language and all the categories that usually separate things. Ella raised her head. Her file said she had bitten a handler for raising his arm too quickly. Her file said she was unpredictable in close contact situations. Her file said a lot of things that were true and also, in the way of all files, missed the most important information entirely. She lifted her head, and she looked at his hand, and she pressed her nose against his palm. She breathed in, long, slow, thorough, the way she had once breathed in the air above a buried pressure plate, reading everything it had to tell her. Noah's fingers curved gently around the top of her muzzle. Neither of them moved for a long time. In the corridor, Tom put his hand against the wall and stared at the ceiling and breathed carefully through his nose. He had been volunteering here for 11 years, and he had seen many things. He had never seen anything quite like this. He kept recording. The arrangement took shape through the following days with the organic logic of something that had always been meant to happen. Mary brought Noah to the shelter every afternoon. Tom applied for emergency foster placement so that Ella could spend evenings at the Webb house on a trial basis. Sandra agreed, with the stipulation that Ella be returned immediately if there was any incident. There were no incidents. What there was, instead, was the gradual establishment of a small shared world. Ella's kennel in the corner of Noah's room at night, the boy's hand dropping over the side of the bed to rest in her fur in the dark, the dog's slow breathing calibrating itself to match his. They were both light sleepers. They both had reasons to be. The thunder came on the fourth night, at around 3 in the morning, a deep, rolling crack that came with no warning and hit the bedroom windows with the force of something much larger than sound. Ella was on her feet before it finished, her body rigid, her eyes wide and fixed on nothing. The trembling started in her hindquarters and moved forward through her whole body in waves, and the sound that came from her was the sound of an animal in a memory she could not leave, low and involuntary, pressed out between closed teeth. From the bed, a different sound, small, caught in the throat. Noah's. He had sat up straight with his knees against his chest, and his face, in the blue-white flash of lightning through the curtains, was the face of a boy underground, in the dark, listening to the rock shift above him. They found each other by sound and smell in the dark. Ella came to the bed and pressed her shoulder against the mattress edge, and Noah slid off the bed to the floor and put both arms around her neck. She was shaking. He was shaking. The thunder came again, and they flinched together, and neither of them ran because there was nowhere to run that the other one wasn't, and somehow that was enough to make staying possible. Mary found them in the morning, asleep on the floor, the boy curled around the dog with his face pressed into her fur, the dog with her chin on his back, and her eyes open and watchful in the early light. She stood in the doorway for a long time without saying anything. Then she went to the kitchen and made coffee and stood at the counter and allowed herself, for the first time since September, to think. Maybe. Noah's drawings had always been obsessive in their detail, but in the weeks after Ella came to the house, they acquired a new quality, a kind of urgency, as though the pencil was trying to get ahead of something. He drew the Callaway Mines tunnel system from memory, based on everything his father had described over the years at the dinner table. The main east-west shaft, the secondary cross-tunnels, the ventilation passages, the old water drainage system. He drew the lateral connection to the Ridgeback Resources extension. He had heard his father mention it once, the way you mention something that troubles you, but that you can't quite name. He drew the eastern section with its compromised supports, the stress fractures he had imagined. One afternoon in late October, He had the drawings spread across the kitchen table. Ella was lying nearby, as she usually was, her nose working the ambient air of the room in the low-level continuous survey that she maintained even in rest. She raised her head. She got up. She walked to the table. Noah looked up. Ella had never shown interest in his drawings before. She tolerated them with the patient indifference of an animal who had more important things to track, like the sound of cars on the road and the specific footstep pattern of the mail carrier. But now she stood with her nose over the table and her nostrils flaring with rapid, focused attention, and the look on her face, if a dog's face could be said to show recognition, was the look of finding something. She was pointing at a specific section of his drawing. Not literally pointing, not the way a trained dog points at a target in a field exercise, but her entire body was oriented toward one part of the map. Her weight shifted forward, her attention narrowed to a precision that Noah recognized because he had seen something like it once, in his father's face, in the weeks before the collapse. That particular quality of a person who knows something and doesn't yet know what to do with knowing it. He leaned forward and looked at where her nose was hovering. The eastern section, the lateral extension. He picked up his pencil. He looked at her. She held very still. He drew an X. Sheriff Dale Grant was a large man who had been handsome in a blunt, square-jawed way when he was younger, and who now carried that former handsomeness like a reputation that preceded him. It smoothed his path. It made people trust him automatically. It worked like a credential. He had been sheriff for 23 years. He had been re-elected 5 times. He was, by any conventional measure, a pillar of the community. He came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon when Mary had just come off a 12-hour shift. He stood on the porch in his uniform and his Stetson, and he held his hat in his hands, and he spoke to her in a voice carefully tuned to convey both authority and sympathy. He had spent years perfecting that particular chord. "I heard you've been asking questions," he said. "About the mine. About the timeline." He paused. "People are talking, Mary, and I'm worried about you. You're grieving. You're exhausted. The last thing you need is to get yourself tied up in theories that are going to cause you pain and lead nowhere." Mary stood in the doorway with her arms folded. She had the specific kind of stillness that nurses learn, the stillness of someone who has been in rooms with difficult news and has learned that the most important thing is to not let the difficult news see how much of you it's getting. "I haven't been asking questions," she said, which was technically true. She had been listening to Noah's pencil move across paper at 3 in the morning. She had been reading the drawings. "Good," Grant said. He smiled the smile. Because Marcus's accident, it was a tragedy, but it was an accident, and the investigation was thorough. Sometimes terrible things happen and there's no one to blame, and the only healthy thing to do is accept that and move forward. He held her gaze for a moment too long. "For your sake, and for Noah's." He put his hat back on. In Noah's room, Ella was standing at the window. She had heard the car on the road 4 minutes before it arrived, the particular engine note, the deliberate slowness of the approach. She watched through the glass as the sheriff walked back to his patrol car. Her ears were flat. Her tail was still. She smelled something on the outside air, something that had come from him, carried in the wake of his body heat. It was the smell of a specific kind of wrongness, not violence exactly, though there was an edge of that too. It was the smell of the thing she had learned to recognize in Kandahar as the worst possible situation, a hidden danger, buried under something that looked safe. She kept her eyes on the patrol car until it was gone from sight. Then she went to Noah's side and pressed herself against his leg, and he put his hand on her head, and they stood at the window together and looked at the road where the car had been. He left before dawn on November 2nd. Mary was sleeping, deeply, for the first time in weeks, the sleep of a person whose body has finally won the argument with their nervous system. She did not hear Noah ease out of bed, dress in the dark, or take his backpack from the closet. She did not hear him go to the front door. He had planned it carefully, in the methodical, silent way that he planned everything now. He had studied the county road map. He had identified the access point to the old mine road, the back way, through the nature preserve, the path that wasn't blocked by the sheriff's department's orange safety tape. He had packed a flashlight, his notebook, a water bottle, and his pencils, in the specific backpack he prepared with the careful seriousness of a boy who understood, at 10 years old, that some things matter enough to be done right. He needed to see the X. He needed to see the section of tunnel that Ella had pointed to with her whole body, the eastern lateral extension that existed on no official map. He didn't know what he would find. He knew what his father had found: the stress fractures, the seeping water, the breath-held feeling. And he knew that his father's findings had been buried along with his father, and that as long as they stayed buried, the story the sheriff was telling was the only story. He was 10 years old, and he understood this with a clarity that should have been beyond his years, except that grief has a way of accelerating certain kinds of understanding. He was 2 miles down Ridgeback Road before anyone noticed he was gone. Ella knew he was gone before Mary did. She knew it in the way she knew most things, through the specific absence of his smell from the space where his smell was supposed to be. His room smelled of him in 1,000 layered ways: the cotton of his sheets, the pencil graphite, the particular chemical signature of his skin. When he was in the room, those smells were recent and present. When he wasn't, they hung in the air like an echo, fading at a rate she could track. She tracked it, and she knew he had been gone for almost 2 hours. She went to Mary's room. She pushed the door open with her nose. She stood at the bedside. Mary woke to 75 pounds of German Shepherd pressed against her arm and looked up into amber eyes that held a quality of urgency she had never seen in a dog's eyes before. "Ella? What?" She was out of bed in 5 seconds. Noah's room was empty. His backpack was gone. On his desk, a single drawing, left deliberately: the tunnel map, with the X circled twice, and below it, in the careful block letters he used when he wanted to be understood, "I have to go see." Mary grabbed her phone and her keys. She ran for the door and stopped. Ella was already outside. She had gone through the dog door. She had found it, or figured it out, or perhaps simply pushed through the flap with the same focused urgency she brought to everything now. She was in the yard, nose down on the ground, reading the story of where Noah had walked. It was still dark. The smell of rain was in the air, distant but accelerating. Mary looked at the dog. The dog looked at the road. "Go," Mary said. Ella went. She found the scent trail immediately: fresh, clear, unambiguous, the specific print of Noah's sneakers in the damp grass at the road's edge. She followed it at a lope, not a sprint, conserving herself the way she had been trained to, reading the trail's information as she moved. He had walked steadily, no hesitation, no doubling back. He knew where he was going. She had his smell in her nose like a compass bearing. She ran. The access path through the nature preserve was unmarked and overgrown, but Noah had studied the topographic maps carefully, and he found it without difficulty. The Eastern Mine Road was a 1/4 mile beyond the preserve boundary, a gravel track that official vehicles no longer used, its surface obscured by 2 seasons of vegetation growth, but still solid underfoot. He reached the old access gate at 7:40 in the morning. The gate was padlocked, but the fence on either side had subsided over the years, and there was a gap at the bottom that a 10-year-old boy could manage easily. The mine entrance, the main one, the sealed one, was another 100 yards in. But the lateral entrance his father had described, the Ridgeback Resources access that had been dug through the hillside on the eastern side, was in a different location. He found it by looking for what didn't belong: a section of hillside where the vegetation was wrong, too sparse, too recently disturbed, the soil compacted in a pattern that spoke of vehicle traffic. The entrance was hidden behind a section of corrugated metal sheeting, deliberately positioned to look like abandoned debris. Noah pushed it aside. The darkness beyond smelled like his father's work clothes. That was the first thing. That was almost enough to stop him. He turned on his flashlight and went in. The tunnel was low, built for utility, not comfort. The walls were reinforced concrete for the first 15 feet, then bare rock, then a mixture of rock and wooden supports that grew increasingly stressed-looking as he moved deeper. He could see the stress fractures in the rock, exactly where he had drawn them. He could see the water seepage on the east wall, a dark stain spreading down from a crack that was wider than it should have been. And then he saw the other thing. It was in an alcove off the main passage, a storage area, probably, originally. It was dark, and he had to step off the main path to reach it. He held his flashlight on what he saw and stood very still for a long time. Detonators, blasting caps, sections of det cord, coiled and tagged. A partial case of explosive charges, the kind used in mining operations, the kind used in controlled blasts to break rock, the kind that left chemical signatures in the soil and air for months afterward. The kind a dog trained to detect them could find from 40 feet away. He opened his notebook. He began to draw. The storm that had been building for 2 days arrived all at once, the way a decision does when a person has been avoiding making it. The pressure dropped. The temperature dropped. The first rain came in isolated sheets, then consolidated into a wall. On the hillside above the Callaway mine, the water table, already at capacity from the previous week's rain, still holding the weight of autumn, began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing certainty, the way water moves when given permission. The soil above the eastern shaft, compromised by years of unauthorized blasting and the structural damage of the September collapse, absorbed what it could. Then it released what it couldn't hold. Ella reached the mine road fence at 7:55, Noah's scent leading her directly to the gap in the fence with an efficiency that felt like the old days, the clarity of a task, a direction, a person to find. She went through the fence without slowing and found the access path by scent, the compressed soil, the recent human footprint, the ghost of Noah's sneakers. She was 50 yards from the hidden entrance when she stopped. The air coming out of the hillside, pushed by the storm pressure change, filtered through rock and soil and whatever was in that alcove, hit her olfactory system with a force that dropped her feet into a crouch before she had processed it consciously. She knew that smell. RDX. TTP. The specific, unmistakable chemical language of explosive compounds that she had spent 3 years learning in the way other dogs learned to sit and stay. The way it hit her was physical. Her whole body recoiled and then, 3 seconds later, overrode the recoil, because there was also something else. Noah's smell, inside that darkness, recent and close and alive. She breathed in again. The chemical smell was cold and stable. Old compounds, not fresh, not active, not triggered, not yet. She went in. She found him in the alcove with his flashlight and his notebook, drawing with the focused intensity of someone who doesn't hear the rain until it's too loud to ignore. She pressed her nose against his arm. He startled, then grabbed her. Ella, she had hold of his sleeve. His left sleeve, the same sleeve in the same grip she had used in that Market District Street 6 years ago and 10,000 miles away, and the muscle memory of it was so absolute and so immediate that she had it before she thought about it. She pulled. He resisted for a moment. He wanted to keep drawing. He wasn't finished. There were things here that needed to be recorded. And then the sound reached them both simultaneously. The deep, percussive groan of a hillside in motion, closer and faster than the rain had prepared them for. Noah put his notebook in his backpack and he ran. They came out of the tunnel entrance into a wall of rain and noise. The hillside above them was moving, not dramatically, not in the catastrophic way that September had moved, but in the steady, unstoppable way of water finding its path. The gravel road was already ankle-deep in running water. The access path through the preserve was cut off. She could smell it, the different quality of water in that direction, heavier, carrying soil. She ran east. She had his sleeve, and she ran and he ran with her, his sneakers hitting the flooded gravel with the sound of someone beating water, his free hand pressed against his backpack to keep it from bouncing. The water was rising around their feet. A section of the hillside to their left let go with a sound like a truck rolling over a bridge, and a debris plume crossed the road 20 feet behind them. She pulled him up. She pulled him to the high ground at the road's eastern edge, along the fence line, through a section of forest that was above the water level. She pulled him by instinct and by smell and by the knowledge, encoded in her bones, of which way was safe. The same knowledge she had used to pull Daniel across the burning street. The same knowledge she had used every day for 3 years in places where the ground could not be trusted. They emerged from the tree-line onto the flat ground of the preserve's eastern meadow as the first emergency vehicles appeared on the main road. Mary was in the third car. Noah hit his mother at a full run, and she took him, and they both went down to the wet grass together, and she held him so hard he made a sound that was not quite a word, but was almost one. Ella stopped running. She stood in the rain. She breathed. He came from the access road in a patrol car, the lights off, the way a person comes when they are not supposed to be seen. Sheriff Grant had received the automated weather alert at 10 o'clock that morning and had thought immediately, not of the flooding families or the road closures or any of the other things a sheriff should think of in a weather emergency, but of the alcove off the eastern tunnel of the Callaway mine. He had known the materials were there. He had known for months. He had meant to have them removed. He had been told, by the Ridgeback Resources contacts who spoke to him through intermediaries and never by phone, that it had been handled. It had not been handled. He had believed the mine access was secure. It was not secure. There was a gap in the fence that he should have checked. He saw the web boy and the dog and the mother from the road, in the lights of the emergency vehicles 50 yards away, and he knew with the cold certainty of a person seeing a story in that it was over if that notebook reached anyone with the authority to act on it. He got out of the car. He had his hand on the sidearm at his hip when Ella turned. She had placed herself between Noah and the road with the same instinct, the same practiced geometry, that had put her between the EOD team and the uncleared building 100 times in Afghanistan. She did not bark. She did not growl. She stood in the rain and she fixed Sheriff Grant with the specific, evaluative attention of an animal that has been trained to assess threat at the highest possible level of precision. And what she saw in him, the hand on the weapon, the particular forward lean of a man who has made a decision he cannot take back, registered in her body as the code red, all systems, absolute clarity of a confirmed threat. She planted her feet. Grant stopped. Something in the dog's absolute stillness, the complete absence of the trembling, flinching, noise-reactive animal described in her behavioral file, stopped him more effectively than any command could have. She was looking at him with the eyes of something that had been in worse places than this and was not afraid of him. He looked at her for a long moment. Then a flashlight beam swept across him from the direction of the emergency vehicles. Then another. Then a voice, one of his own deputies, calling his name in a confused, uncertain register. Grant's hand moved away from his weapon. He turned toward the lights. Tom had been recording since October 13th. That was what the media reports would say later when they ran the story, that an elderly shelter volunteer had been routinely documenting his foster placement work on his phone, and that the footage he had accumulated over 3 weeks included, incidentally, 37 minutes of footage of a boy sitting on the floor of an animal shelter and a dog choosing him. Footage that showed clearly the date and location and the condition of the dog who was scheduled to be euthanized. It also included footage of a conversation Tom had filmed through the rescue center's office window when he saw Sheriff Grant's car pull into the parking lot on October 28th, the day Grant had come in person to ask Sandra Cole to accelerate the timeline on what he called the aggressive animal in Kennel 12. Tom had filmed that conversation. He had filmed the sheriff's face when Sandra refused. He had filmed the specific quality of Grant's expression, which was the expression of a man who was accustomed to things going his way. Tom had been at the preserve's eastern meadow on the morning of November 2nd as well, because he had received Mary's panic call at 6:55 and had arrived before the emergency services. He had filmed the hillside moving. He had filmed Ella emerging from the mine entrance with Noah's sleeve in her teeth. He had filmed Grant's patrol car arriving with its lights off, and he had filmed Grant's approach, and he had filmed Ella standing between the sheriff and the boy, and he had filmed the hand on the weapon. He had also, 3 weeks earlier, used his nephew's IT knowledge to anonymously forward his accumulated footage to 2 local journalists, a state investigative reporter, and the Oregon Department of Justice's tip line, along with a scan of Noah's tunnel drawing and a PDF of Marcus Webb's 2 internal safety complaints, which he had obtained from a former Ridgeback Resources employee who had her own reasons for wanting the truth out. The state investigators had been in Hallow Creek for 1 week already when the storm broke on November 2nd. They had been asking questions quietly, building a case. The night's events were not the beginning of the end for Sheriff Grant. They were the moment the end could no longer be disguised as anything else. Grant was arrested on November 4th. The Ridgeback Resources executives who had authorized the unpermitted operations were arrested in Portland on November 7th. The charges included bribery, falsification of government records, reckless endangerment, and, following the discovery of the unexploded materials in the lateral tunnel, criminal mishandling of explosive devices. The case that Noah had drawn, in pencil, in the silence where his words used to be, turned out to be the most important document in a file that would eventually put 3 people in federal prison. The ceremony was held on December 12th in the Hallow Creek Civic Center, a building that had seen mostly Christmas bazaars and high school graduations and had not previously hosted a doc. Ella sat beside Noah on the stage with the composure of an animal that had been to stranger places than a high school auditorium. She had her dress collar on. The shelter had bought it for the occasion, soft leather with a small silver tag. She sat straight, her ears up, her amber eyes moving over the audience with the alert patience of someone at work. The mayor read the resolution. It established the Hallow Creek Animal Courage Award, backdated to include Ella as its first recipient. It described her service history, the years of deployments, the 41 fines, the day she pulled her handler out of a burning street. It described November 2nd. It described what she had done. The woman from the State Humane Society placed the medallion around her neck. It was bronze, engraved, heavier than most things that get called honors. Ella sniffed it once, briefly, then returned to watching the room. In the audience, Sandra Cole sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the stage. And if she was thinking about the paperwork she had signed on October 11th and then unsigned 4 days later, she did not show it. Tom sat beside her, straight-backed, hands on his knees, wearing the good jacket he kept for occasions that deserved it. He had put his phone away for the day. He had recorded enough. Mary sat in the front row in her hospital scrubs because she had come directly from her shift and had not wanted to be late. She was watching her son. She had been watching her son with this specific quality of attention, the attention of someone memorizing, since the morning in the meadow when he had run into her arms. The mayor stepped back from the microphone and gestured toward Noah. Noah stood up. This had not been planned. The program had not included a speech by Noah, because everyone who knew him understood that he did not give speeches, that the words had been gone since September, that the best outcome anyone hoped for was that he would stand on stage and not be afraid. That was the goal. That was enough. He stood up anyway. He stood in front of the microphone in his good shirt and his jeans and his ink-stained hands, and he looked out at the 400 people filling the auditorium seats. He looked at his mother, who had both hands pressed against her mouth. He looked at Tom, who gave him a small, unhurried nod. He looked at Ella, beside him, who was looking at him with the full, unwavering attention she gave to everything she cared about. The microphone was too high. He reached up and adjusted it, slowly, the way he did everything, with careful intention. Then he spoke. His voice was rough from disuse, low and a little hoarse, the voice of a boy who had been storing words for 2 months and was now choosing the first ones back very carefully. "She saved me," he said. He stopped. He looked at Ella. He put his hand on her head. She leaned into it, slightly, the way she had learned to lean, not with the anxious pressing of an animal seeking reassurance, but with the quiet weight of one creature acknowledging another. "She saved me," he said again, and this time it had a different quality, not a statement of fact, but something closer to a testimony, the kind of thing you say in front of witnesses because some things need witnesses, not just in the mind. Before that, she saved me before that. He looked at the audience. He looked at his mother. "I think we saved each other," he said. "I think that's what it was." He sat back down. The auditorium was completely quiet for 3 seconds, the specific silence of a large group of people who have all felt the same thing at the same time and are still inside it. Then the applause began, and it was the kind of applause that has nothing performative in it, the kind that comes from somewhere involuntary. Mary put her hands down from her mouth. She was crying. She had been crying since she saved me. She would be crying, she thought, for a while yet, and she found that she didn't mind. There was a difference, it turned out, between the tears of grief that drain you and the tears of relief that don't, and she was deep inside the second kind, and the difference felt like the difference between drowning and swimming. In February, a storm came through Hallow Creek that was, by the instruments at the county weather station, the most electrically active storm in the valley's recorded history. The lightning strikes per hour exceeded the century average by a factor of 4. The thunder was continuous and loud enough to rattle windows in their frames. Noah woke at 2 in the morning to the first crack of it and lay still in the dark, listening to his heart. In the corner, he heard Ella shift. He waited. He heard her get up. He heard her cross the floor, 4 paces, measured and even. He felt the weight of her as she lay down beside his bed, pressing against the mattress edge. She did not tremble. The thunder came again, a long, rolling barrage that moved over the house like something with weight and intention. Noah felt his own chest tighten with the old reflex, the body's memory of a different rumble, a different kind of earth moving. He breathed. He put his hand down to her. Her fur was dry. Her sides moved slowly, in and out, with the rhythm of a breathing animal, an animal at rest, an animal that had made a decision. Not dramatic, not celebrated, not an event that anyone would write on a form, but absolute. The decision to be in this room, with this boy, and to find the thunder less large than what she had survived. Noah lay in the dark with his hand in her fur and listened to the storm move east and watched the lightning soften from white to orange and listened to the intervals between thunder growing longer, the way intervals do when a thing is passing. He was not afraid. He was not unafraid either. Fear doesn't leave that cleanly, and neither of them had been pretending that it does. But on the far side of the fear was something he had not felt in a long time, something that didn't have a tidy name, the sense that the night was survivable, that the morning was on its way, that there was enough space in this room for both of their histories and for whatever came next. Ella breathed. Noah breathed. The thunder moved on. The meadow at the eastern edge of the nature preserve, which in November had been a triage point and a convergence of emergency lights and fear, was, by May, a field of knee-high grass that moved in the afternoon wind like water, slow and green, and entirely indifferent to what it had witnessed. Noah came here sometimes after school. He brought his notebook, though he drew different things now. Birds, mostly, and trees, and sometimes the particular way the light came through cloud cover when the weather was changing. He still drew the mine occasionally, but those drawings had changed character. They were flatter, more architectural, less urgent. They were the drawings of someone documenting rather than proving. Ella ran. This was new, and it still surprised him every time. The sheer physical joy of it. The way she moved when there was open space and no threat and no task, and nothing required of her except the pleasure of her own body in motion. She had always moved with purpose before, every movement deliberate, every run a run toward something or away from something. But here, in the meadow, she ran in long arcs and doubles back, nose down and then up, investigating everything with the thorough delight of an animal discovering that the world has more in it than missions and dangers. She came back to him periodically, checking in, the way she always had, the way she probably always would. She would come back at a run and slow at the last moment and press against his knee, and he would put his hand on her back for a moment without stopping what he was drawing, and then she would be off again. His mother was at work. The town was quieter now than it had been in years, with the trial proceeding in the county seat and the Ridgeback Resources case drawing attention from people outside Oregon who cared about mining safety and about what happens when the systems that are supposed to protect people become the things that hurt them instead. His father's name had been in newspapers, spoken in ways that finally matched the man Noah had known. A worker who raised safety concerns and was ignored, a man who was right about what he feared, who deserved better from the institutions that had failed him. It was not enough. Nothing was enough to make that accounting come out even. But there was a difference, Noah was learning, between justice and consolation, between the world doing right by someone and the world simply acknowledging what they were worth. His father was worth acknowledgement. He was getting it. It was not nothing. He finished a drawing of the meadow, a wide shot, trying to catch the scale of it, the way it met the tree line to the east. He looked up. Ella was at the far edge of the field, paused, nose up, reading something in the westerly wind. From where he sat, he could see the old scar on her neck, visible through the fur, the landscape of what she had survived. He could see the silver medallion on her collar, catching the afternoon light. She turned and saw him watching her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the green length of the meadow, the boy with his notebook and the dog with her history. And between them was the thing that had no adequate name. The specific quality of two lives that had been broken and had not healed into their original shapes, but into something different, something stronger along the breaks, the way bone regrows after fracture, denser than before at the site of the injury. Then she ran. She came at him at a full sprint, ears back, all the grace and power of her in motion, covering the distance between them in the time it took him to stand up and laugh. Because this was new too, the laugh, and it still startled him when it came out of him. This ordinary animal sound of delight, and she hit him at a controlled collision that knocked him back into the grass and stood over him, panting, looking down at his face with the expression that he had spent months learning to read and now knew as well as any language he had ever spoken. "I am here," it said. "We are here." He grabbed her and pulled her down, and they lay in the spring grass in the afternoon light, a 10-year-old boy who had found his voice again and a 7-year-old dog who had found her stillness, and the wind moved over the meadow. and the sun was warm, and the next thing was unknown, and that was all right. That was all right. The psychological rehabilitation literature has a term, post-traumatic growth, for the phenomenon in which individuals who have survived severe trauma sometimes develop, in the aftermath, an increased sense of personal strength, deeper interpersonal relationships, and a greater appreciation for life than they had before the trauma occurred. It is important to note that this is not the same as recovery. The trauma remains. The injury is real. What changes is the relationship between the injured person and what they have been injured by, a shift from being defined by what was done to them to being defined by what they chose afterward. What Noah chose, in the weeks and months after the storm, was to keep drawing, to keep observing, and eventually to keep talking. He spoke to a therapist, then to his mother, then, with the slow, considered care of someone who understands the weight of words, to other people. He spoke at his father's memorial, re-performed after the case's conclusion, when the truth about the mine's failure was in the public record. He spoke at the state capitol, to a legislative committee reviewing mining safety regulations, bringing his notebook of tunnel drawings with him. He was 11 years old by then. The drawings were very good. What Ella chose is harder to quantify, because dogs don't write testimony and their choices aren't debatable in courts of law. But the behaviorist who assessed her in February, as part of the award documentation process, noted what Tom had always believed and Sandra had come to acknowledge, that the behavioral profile documented in her original file, the noise sensitivity, the aggression towards sudden movement, the social withdrawal, had altered substantially. Not disappeared, altered. This is not a dog who has stopped being afraid. The assessment read, "This is a dog who has learned to coexist with fear without being controlled by it." That distinction matters. It does. Tom still volunteers at the rescue center on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He moves a little slower now. His phone's memory holds more footage than he will ever need, most of which is of ordinary days. Dogs eating, dogs sleeping, dogs showing visitors the particular cautious hopefulness that animals in shelters develop when they have decided to keep trying. He posts some of it occasionally to a small online following he built without fully understanding how, and he answers the comments personally, one at a time. Mary was promoted to charge nurse at Hallow Creek Hospital. She works day shifts when possible. She is home for dinner most nights. On the nights she's late, Noah feeds Ella, and they eat together at the kitchen table, the boy and the dog, and wait. Spring comes every year to the meadow at the Eastern Preserve. The grass grows. The light changes, as light does, differently every afternoon and never exactly the same twice. And if you went there on the right May afternoon, you might see a boy running in the long green grass and a dog running behind him, and you might not know anything about what they had been to each other before this moment, before the meadow, before the spring. But you would know, watching them, that they were safe. You would know that absolutely, in the way you sometimes know certain things without being able to explain how. The way Ella knew, on the morning she ran into the flood, that the scent on the rain-soaked air was worth running toward. The way no one knew, on the floor of the rescue shelter, that the quiet dog at the end of the row was the only one in the building who understood what he was. Some knowledge doesn't need explanation. It only needs to be true. The bravest thing is not the running into the fire. The bravest thing is deciding, after everything, to trust again.